All right, welcome to week 3, Northern Renaissance Art and Architecture, chapter 20. All right, so first thing I want you to note is that you will notice, looking through the slides, that all the figures refer to chapter 19. And it is the correct week. These are the correct slides. However, Pearson updated their book this year. And so some of my slideshows, yes, they just don't correspond with the chapters anymore, but it's all the same information, all the same artworks. I double checked and went through the book and the slides. Everything matches up. So please don't worry if you notice that. Okay, so this week's tasks. You'll want to read chapter 21 for next week. Okay, so this week is chapter 20. Next week, we'll be discussing chapter 21. So your discussion question for this week and also your first discussion question, everyone did a great job. So keep up the good work. So your 2 assignments for this week. All right, you'll have a discussion board again. So discuss the symbolic meaning that 15th century viewers would have comprehended in the objects in the domestic environments of either the Merode altarpiece or the Afronini double portrait. So those are both in the slideshow and they're both in the book in chapter 20. Even though it says refer to figure 19.1, 1910, please refer to chapter 20. They're both in there. And then for your journal entry, instead of the tempera paints and frescoes favored by Italian Renaissance artists, Flemish painters often worked in oils. How do you think the properties of oil paints might have impacted the style of Flemish paintings? What differences can be seen in terms of texture, scale, and light? Okay, so art forms that this unit will cover, and we will look at one of each for sure during this video lecture, are oil paintings, woodcut and engravings, and architecture. Oops. Okay, so 14th century versus 15th century European art. So there was a big shift between the 14th and 15th century. Remember last week we're discussing the Black Plague and the impact that had on art and the 100 Years' War. So first I'll just describe some key differences between 14th and 15th century art. So naturalism. While 14th century art still had a somewhat stylized symbolic approach to representation, the 15th century saw a very marked shift towards more naturalistic portraits or portrayals of people, nature, and spaces. Perspective. So the 14th century had no systematic use of linear perspective. So if you've taken an art class, you might have done a linear perspective drawing where everything goes back to a point. And so by the 15th century, perspective became a fundamental tool in art, so enabling artists to create depth in more realistic proportions instead of just layering things like they did in the 14th century art. So mediums and techniques. So oil painting began to gain prominence in the 15th century and offered more vibrant colors and better opportunities for blending and shading than tempera, which was dominant in the 14th century. But it still continues into the 15th century. So there's more focus on the individual. In the 14th century, religious and allegorical themes dominated, and human figures were often depicted in a more symbolic manner, even though we did see the rendering of more individual faces. By the 15th century, there was an increased focus on humanism, and this led to more realism and an individualistic approach to portraits and human subjects. And we will look and inspect a couple portraits. And then cultural and intellectual shifts. So the 15th century saw the rise of the Renaissance, which is a movement which is grounded in the revival of classical antiquity and the study of human nature. So it's really the rise, again, after disease and this kind of age of depression. So there's, increased, science, interest in the science, the arts, literature, mathematics, everything. And this is contrasted with the more spiritual and religious preoccupations of the 14th century. So there still is a lot of religious and spiritual art in the 15th century, but we're seeing different approaches. So in summary, the 14th century was largely Gothic, focusing more on religious themes and very limited naturalism. And the 15th century is like the early Renaissance, and it's shifting more to classical ideals, naturalism, perspective, humanism, and the revival of intellectualism. Okay, so learning objectives. So identify the hallmark of 15th century Northern Europe art, formal, technical, and expressive qualities. Interpret the meaning of 15th century Northern European artworks based on themes, subjects, and symbols. So you will be doing that directly in your journal entries and your discussion. And relate 15th century Northern European artists to their cultural, economic, and political contexts. So apply vocabulary and concepts related to 15th century European art and artists and art history. Interpret. Oh, no, I didn't read this one yet. Interpret a work of 15th century Northern European art using the methods of observation, comparison, and deductive reasoning. So again, you'll be doing this in your discussion and journal. It just sounds very similar to the previous slide. And select visual and textual evidence in various media to support an argument and interpretation of work of Northern European art. So again, these will all be incorporated into your assignments. All right, so this, I don't want to talk too much about this painting, but he is such an important artist of the time. But you'll probably, I know a lot of you will probably choose this painting for your discussion question. So Jan van Eyck's double portrait of Giovanni Arnolini and his wife, painted in 1434, is a very, very classic Northern Renaissance painting. So it's celebrated for its extraordinary realism, certainly compared to the 14th century, and also its symbolism and its detail. So it's painted in oil on wooden panel, and it demonstrates the artist's mastery of the medium through luminous color, precise textures, and very subtle light effects, which, he also uses the window to create those light effects, that's portrayed in the painting. So it suggests themes of marriage, wealth, and fidelity. And we also notice things as the dog. I don't want to give too much away, but you can think about all the objects that are portrayed in this double portrait and what they might represent. Like, what would the dog represent? Or the mirror in the background, what would it represent? And also the mysterious, the woman is seen as a very mysterious figure, you know? And so there's a lot of, I guess, different conclusions about what this portrait means, what its interpretation is, especially of the woman. So that is something that you can read about in the book. And yes, so there'll be lots of information and you can talk about it in the discussion. All right, so we'll look at the learning objectives. So identify the visual hallmarks of 15th century Northern European art for its formal, technical, and expressive qualities, and interpret the meaning of artworks based on themes, subjects, and symbols. So right here, you will be doing that. So the 15th century in Northern European art is distinguished by remarkable attention to its detail. And it has a very rich symbolic meaning that's infused in a lot of the artworks. So the visual hallmarks of this period include a very strong emphasis on realism, texture, and as we see here in this portrait, a mastery of oil painting. So John Van Eyck, he used very thin layers of translucent glaze so building up different layers of this translucent glaze, which gives the portrait a very luminous look and a richness to the details. Okay. And so expressively, figures are very calm, solemn, and introspective. And this reflects the period's focus on devotion to a personal spirituality. So that's something that you see in this portrait, but you'll see in many of the paintings and portraits that we look at. So secondly, the meaning of 15th century Northern European works is closely tied to religious themes, even though there is, some movement away from that and going more into everyday life. So common subjects include the Virgin Mary, Christ, saints, and scenes from the Bible. So we will investigate some altarpieces, but they're often portrayed in contemporary settings to make them feel like more relatable to the people that are viewing them. So objects within the paintings, religious or common, remember, usually have a symbolism. I can't really emphasize that enough. So everything is put in the painting for a reason that is telling a story, because during this time, people still really couldn't read. So objects weren't just placed or depicted in paintings or put into sculptures or altarpieces as compositional elements or just what's being observed, but they usually were a part of the story or used as a tool to teach the viewer something. So formal skill and symbolic richness kind of define the distinctive characteristics of art during this period. Okay, so the Northern Renaissance, so observing detail and detailing nature accurately through art became very popular. Concepts of individual personalities are very prominent, and the new power of Flanders and the Greater Netherlands began to challenge the traditions of the church. Okay, so the Dukes of Burgundy were very important patrons of the art during the Northern Renaissance in the 15th century, and they helped bring the golden age that rivaled the Italian Renaissance. So the Duke of Burgundy, their court, was based in modern-day Belgium and the Netherlands and parts of France, and had become the center of power, wealth, and artistic innovation. So the Dukes of Burgundy's rule extended across important Flemish and Netherlands cities, placing them in control of some of the wealthiest cultural centers in Northern Europe. So through the political power and immense patronage, the dukes strongly influenced artistic production and set trends that artists across the region followed. So as major supporters of painters, sculptors, and architects, they effectively became, I guess, they set the taste of the era of late medieval Europe and the beginning of the Renaissance. And under their influence, there was a refined and elegant artistic approach known as the International Gothic style, which spread widely. This style was characterized by graceful figures, decorative detail, and emphasis on courtly elegance, so as it represented them. And it blended different regions of Europe, creating a shared visual language across royal and noble courts. So painting and sculpture for the Chartreuse of de Champol. So Philip the Bold sponsored the building of Chartreuse at Champol. And Melchior Brodelem, so the altarpiece called for scenes of the adoration of the Magi, crucifixion, and entombments, which Brodelem renders in the international style. And here's a close-up of it. Now, some of these slides I'm going to go through really quickly, as I would like to keep the video lectures to about 30 minutes. So Melchior Brodelem's Annunciation, Visitation, Presentation in the Temple, and the Flight to Egypt decorates the exterior wings of the altarpiece created for the Chartreuse de Champol. So it's painted oil on wood panels, and the work represents 4 scenes from the life of Christ arranged in a kind of a continuous landscape. So they all tie together. And the artist blends Gothic decorative elements with emerging naturalism, and especially in the treatment of the architecture and the space. And the figures are elegant and elongated, and the backgrounds show increasing attention to depth and setting. And so this piece reflects the transition from medieval traditions to the more realistic approaches of the Northern Renaissance. Okay, so altars and altarpieces, are very important. So as a table, the altar is a site where priests celebrate Mass. So the altarpieces are painted, carved, and placed at the back of the altar so that they appear to join the altar itself, and then they can open up into a winged, so like a winged altarpiece could be a diptych, so 2 panels, a triptych, or a polypic, so consisting of many panels. All right, so in this essay, Art and Its Context, Altars and Altarpieces, Kathy Morazek explores religious, social, and artistic roles that altars and altarpieces played in Christian worship. So this is a close-up of an altarpiece, and she explains how these works not only function as devotional objects, but as visual tools for teaching biblical stories. Okay. So painting and sculpture for the Chartreuse de Champol. So Klaus Sluter Schluter left the complex of the Well of Moses unfinished at the time of his death. So figures of patriarchs and prophets serve as the pedestal for freestanding figure of Christ on the cross, and it is sculpted with voluminous drapery that creates horizontal folds on their bodies. Okay, if there's anything else I want to say about this. So there is very a lot of individualism in their facial features. He departed from the style of the International Gothic by giving his prophets a very heavy, realistic drapery and strong bodily forms. And the sculptures were part of a large fountain structure that once supported a crucifix above, symbolizing salvation, flowing from the Old Testament prophets. So the intense expressions and detailed textures convey emotion and depth and spiritual authority, and this work marked a very important step towards the realism that would define art, Renaissance art. Okay, so I might be skipping through some slides. So manuscript illumination is still very important, still coveted by wealthy patrons. Okay, so this will be posted for you to look at any time. So you might need to, even in the future, when you do your midterm, you might need to come back and look at these slides. But I'm going to flip through these because I want to get to some architecture and a wood engraving also. But this is a really nice piece. So the Limburgs brothers, February, Life in the Country, from the Tres Reaches Hours, is a miniature painting from an illustrated book of hours, so the devotional book made for the Duke of Berry. So it's rendered in colors on parchment, and the scene shows peasants warming themselves by a fire while tending to daily winter tasks in a snowy landscape. So the artists combine careful observation of rural life with a decorative style. And it's in that Gothic tradition. And at the same time, there's a detailed depiction of the weather, the buildings, the natural space, and also, the growing interest in realism. So it serves a devotional purpose, but also a glimpse into everyday life. So it's both that religious and the everyday life, and they're coming together. So talking about religious themes in contemporary settings. Okay, so here's another page from the Book of Hours. Okay, textiles were also treasured arts of the Renaissance. They were portable, displayable, symbol of wealth, as well as practical means of warmth. All right, so the unicorn tapestry is quite famous. So here's a hunting section that is preserved. And the Order of the Golden Fleece. All right, so the techniques of oil painting. So the limitations of tempera paints resulted in the Flemish preference for oil paints. So it's a very viscous medium that has time to smooth out during the drying process. And additionally, it can be applied in thin layers of glazes to create a very glowing appearance, very luminous. And so in Flanders, civic groups, town councils, and wealthy merchants were important patrons. In the Netherlands, and guilds oversaw nearly every aspect of the members' lives. So artists who moved from one city to another worked as assistants until being granted guild membership, so regardless of their experience or the talent that they brought. All right. So here is a depiction of a workshop. So of the master of a Flemish painter. And we did talk about Jan van Eyck. So the man in a red turban. So really talking about the humanistic portraits. So it's one of the most famous portraits of the Northern Renaissance. And it's believed to be a self-portrait of Van Eyck. So the subject's intense gaze, you notice that right away. It brings engagement with the viewer. And so then there is a very strong sense of individuality and presence. So Van Eyck had a very strong mastery of oil painting, and we see that in the richness of the red tones, the folds of the turban, the details in the man's face. And the dark background helps us focus attention on the sitter, so the sitter being the person portrayed in the portrait. And it also enhances the realism of the face and the emotional impact that it has. Okay, so Van Eyck also worked on altarpieces too. Okay, so now I want to get to a wood carving and an architectural piece. But back here you can see this is a great example of a more realistic perspective. So the second generation of Flemish painters produced work that was simpler, more direct, and easier to understand, but it was more emotionally complex. So Petrus Christus, the artist painted a portrait of a goldsmith serving two customers. All right, so it's in a shop and it's a carefully constructed interior scene that blends everyday life with the rich symbolic meaning that we talked about as a hallmark of Renaissance painting. So it centers on the goldsmith seated at a workbench, meticulously crafting a piece of jewelry, while a well-dressed couple comes in to observe his work. So the artist is able to achieve, extraordinary realism, as we can see on the shine of the metal objects, the texture of the fabrics, the reflection of the light on the glass, and the different way he renders surfaces. The shop is filled with tools, coins, gemstones, and luxury items, all rendered with precise detail, creating a very convincing sense of space and also material wealth. And remember that at this time, wealthy merchants and like dukes were, purchasing and were patroning art at this time. So the iconography suggests the goldsmith may represent more than a simple craftsman, but possibly Saint Eligus, so the patron saint of goldsmiths and metalworkers. So there could be some religious connotations and interpretations in this artwork, and it's supported by the man's calm, dignified appearance and the orderly, almost kind of sacred atmosphere of the shop, which resembles like a devotional space. Like behind him, it almost seems like an altar. So the balance scale represents honesty and fair trade, So it reinforces the moral values associated with righteous labor. So, yes, labor. So, altogether, the painting combines this realism and, just like kind of synthesizing this again and reiterating it, the religious with the everyday life. But the religious theme in this painting is more subtle than some other pieces, and it kind of emphasizes the morality of work. Okay, so now I'm going to just skip ahead slowly but I want you to see these. These pieces, but I want to talk about the woodcuts and also a piece of architecture. All right, and if there's any pieces that you see here that you would like me to expand upon, like in the next lecture, I can always go back and talk about them too. But everything is explained really well in the book. All right, so here we come to across the church of Saints Maclau in Rouen. So it's attributed in part to Pierre Robin. So he is one of the finest examples of flamboyant Gothic architecture in Normandy, France. So it was constructed primarily during the 15th and early 16th centuries, and the church is known for its highly ornate and intricate, delicate and decorative and delicate style. So the exterior facade features elaborate stone tracery, pointed arches, flame-like patterns that give this flamboyant style its name. So multiple sculpted portals are filled with detailed biblical scenes and figures of saints, inviting worshippers into a richly symbolic and sacred space. So inside, the church has this soaring vertical emphasis created by tall columns, ribbed vaults, and large stained glass windows that flood the interior with this colored light. And there's a complex network of stone ribs and ceiling, which adds structural strength and visual elegance. So light plays a crucial role in enhancing the spiritual atmosphere. And that's also done in paintings too. So there is a connection between architecture and paintings, especially with this play on light and how important light is spiritually and how it's represented or brought in through the buildings. So the chapels allowed for private prayer and display of altarpieces and relics, and Saint Maclau reflects the late medieval emphasis on elaborate craftsmanship and emotional impacts in religious architecture. So overall, it demonstrates how Gothic design moved towards greater decoration and more like dramatic visual effects in the 15th century. All right, and here there should be like, yes, an interior plan of it. So you can see how spacious it is and how the light would fill up the room. Okay, so here's the interior courthouse, which was, yes, so the interior courtyard so that would be behind in the back of the church. Okay. And then there is a woodcut coming up. Okay, so the graphic arts. So only in the 15th century did woodblock printing become, so it became like a really important like tool to start mass producing text and images versus needing to copying things by hand. So they were so woodcut and engraving are techniques used by printmakers. So that is like when you're taking, for example, like for woodcut, you're taking a piece of wood, and the artist takes a cutting tool and they cut into the wood and they cut away all the negative space. And when they put the paper on it, or they ink it up first, and you put the paper on it, and you take that off, and then you get the positive image. So as we see in this piece. So in Martin Schauengower's The Temptations of St. Anthony, so 1470 to 1480, is a highly detailed engraving that demonstrates the technical skill of printmaking in the Northern Renaissance. So they were very, very skilled at this and went into very fine detail. So the scene depicts St. Anthony being violently attacked and carried into the air by a swarm of grotesque demons and fantastical creatures. So each monster and everything is detailed with, precision, and this heightens the chaos and the terror. So despite the assault, St. Anthony remains calm and composed, which symbolizes spiritual strength and faith. So Schauengower's use of fine lines and cross-hatching. So cross-hatching is a way of shading where you're kind of like crossing marks against each other to create the shadow, which was really the only way to create shadow, detailed shadow, and kind of like this gradient shadow in engraving and woodcuts. So this helps. The cross-hatching creates dramatic contrast of light and shadow, especially with the gradient that he's able to do. So this gives the figures depth, and it also helps with movement. And the swirling composition kind of pulls the viewer's eye around the image and emphasizes the nature of the temptation. So this engraving reflects beliefs about the physical and spiritual struggles faced by the holy figures, and it served as a devotional image. And because engravings could be reproduced easily, works like this helped spread religious imagery to a wider audience. So this is another important aspect of this new technology of woodcut engravings, is like being able to mass produce things. Even though the engravings and woodcuts themselves took a long time to make, that once they were made, they could really be easily widespread to a bigger audience. So this kind of, is kind of bringing us into the Renaissance. All right, and also printed books. So the use of woodcuts began to replace the manuscripts, and so we get into the printed book, and also movable type printing was achieved with the Gutenberg press. So this is a huge advancement in technology. And so rapid spread of text enhanced intellectual and spiritual life across Europe. All right. And so, so this is kind of wrapping up week 3. And Yes, so far everyone has done a really great job with their journal entries and discussion. But if you have any questions, again, please reach out to me. I check my emails and I'm happy to meet with you and discuss anything that you might be concerned about. All right, everyone, have a great week and stay warm.